Hey everybody, can you hear? So this is going to be a series of mid-league builds that I'm putting out mainly because I messed up and just ran out of content. and these were builds that I was working on for next league, but I'm breaking them out early just so I have something on my channel for the for this week. For anyone who hasn't watched any of my build videos before, I make builds for casual Path of Exile players. That means, you know, if you're someone who has thousands of hours in the game and have regularly gone to pinnacle content and wrecked the like the Ubers and all that, then this is not for you. This is content for people who maybe they'll get to maps. Maybe they'll get there. Maybe they'll finish the campaign. But sometimes not. You know, like casual is casual. You know, casual means that you don't really have too much time to play the game. So you're just looking for something that is fun for the interim of when you have time to play the game. Yeah, so with that out of the way, these builds are also always going to be centered around transfigured gems. So those are special versions of the gems that exist in Path of Exile that have special effects that are different than the core gems in the game, just to add a little extra flavor to what we're doing here. Out of the way, let's get going. So this final build is actually going to be what is commonly referred to in these communities as a meta build. So this one is one that actually goes in line with the changes that were made, and something that is actually very powerful, which is something I usually try to avoid doing just because I find those kind of builds boring. But in this case, the reason that I spent any time putting this together is because I noticed that like all of the big content creators that do all the meta stuff, for some reason, like no one did this particular combination, even though like from the patch notes for this league, like I thought like this one, like the moment I read through them, like this was like a no-brainer for me, like as like how you'd want to approach all the new Bleed stuff. But for whatever reason, nobody did this one, so I decided to put it together just so at the very least, you know, people are aware that this is an incredibly powerful combination that, you know, people who are involved in doing meta stuff should probably be using just because it is crazy strong. So this here is a bleed build, but it is an off-kilter bleed build. Now obviously going Gladiator is as meta as you can get when it comes to bleed. You know, because they have the Jagged Technique Ascendancy passive, which, you know, like makes it that their bleeds can be the strongest bleeds out of anybody's. But you can see here that I didn't take this one. I intentionally didn't take it because the point of this build isn't to show how to do this build as a Gladiator. It's to show how to do this build as anyone who has access to this part of the tree. You know, so pretty much any Gladiator, any Marauder, some Inquisitors, maybe even Scions can do this. But essentially, like, you know, like what I put together is actually a Boneshatter build. So Boneshatter of Carnage is a transfigured version of Boneshatter. It has a massive attack damage bonus, as you can see there. It gives a very large reduction to enemy stun threshold, and anytime you stun an enemy with this skill, you perform a pulse that deals damage to enemies around the stunned enemy. Like, the pulse might also affect the enemy. I'm actually not sure whether or not the pulse affects the enemy, but it definitely affects the enemies around the enemy that was hit with the pulse. I mean, like the enemy that was stunned by Boneshatter. But if you have ever used Boneshatter before, you might be noticing that there's a key thing that's missing from this version that's on the other two versions. Regular Boneshatter and the other transfigured version of Boneshatter all build trauma. And when they build trauma, they gain extra flat... I'm sorry. They have extra flat physical damage. And then they also add more physical damage per stack of trauma, which is how, you know, those Boneshatters get really big that way, but that's why that their attack damage is much smaller than this version of Boneshatter. So you can see here, this regular Boneshatter has that big flat bonus to attack physical damage, and then as it gains trauma, it gains extra physical damage. Well, I'm sorry, it just adds more damage. Like it doesn't add physical damage, it adds more damage. So whatever damage you have, it gets increased by it gets multiplied based on how many stacks of trauma you have. And the trauma stacks last 6 seconds. So, you know, so it builds up, but you can see that the attack damage is tremendously lower. This level 17 Boneshatter has a 320% attack damage, and this level 17 Boneshatter of Carnage has 570. So, you know, it's a big difference. But the reason that, you know, I felt that this was like such an obvious skill to use for the new bleed stuff that's happening is because, like, that big reduced enemy stun threshold that Boneshatter has, well, you know, that this version of Boneshatter has, you can up that even more using stun support, and then invest into even more stun threshold, reduced enemy stun threshold in the tree, which we're seeing on all of these spots. So some more right here, and then a big one right there. And by having all of that reduced enemy stun threshold and investing into lots of bleed, so lots of chance to bleed, lots of damage over time with bleeding, a chance to aggravate bleeding on targets you hit, more chance to cause bleeding, more damage with bleeding, increased bleed duration, and then you can grab the bleed masteries that make it that after a while we guarantee that we aggravate bleeding, but more importantly, we're able to grab the mastery that makes it that every time we stun an enemy with attacks, we have a very large chance to aggravate bleeding. This right here, like doing this combination, is what makes it that, you know, like you can do this as anyone, you know, like anyone with ready access to this part of the tree. You know, it's not really something you want to try doing as a witch or a witch shadow or ranger because of their positioning, but as pretty much everything else, like, you know, like you have very easy access to all of these nodes that make it very easy to get this particular skill combination going. And just to go over aggravation real quick, when you aggravate bleeding, like, so a key component to bleeding in Path of Exile is that when you cause bleeding, it does a certain amount of physical damage over time to the enemy based on the attack that caused the bleeding. However, if an enemy starts moving while they're bleeding, then that amount is increased by tremendously. What aggravation does is it causes the effect of the enemy moving around without you having to lead the enemy around. Going into our ascendancy selections of what I did here, I got gratuitous violence just because making it that enemies explode and deal 20% of their life as physical damage to enemies around them. It's a nice bit of just extra AoE that you have at your disposal. You know, so it's free extra damage. Then Weapon Master, the reason we took this is because if you're using a Mace or Scepter, then your area of effect is even bigger. And by taking War of Attrition, if we're up against a rare unique enemy, then, you know, we're just gaining more damage over time. You know, like over time, like we're just getting stronger and stronger, which is very dangerous for them. Other weapon of choice here is a Pile Driver, because Pile Drivers have a very large implicit reduced enemy stun threshold bonus. and I was able to roll a little extra reduced enemy stun threshold on this. It has some elemental damages, which is unfortunate, you know, so if you ever see, like, if you have this build going and you get into maps and you see the map modifier to reflect elemental damage, re-roll the map. Re-roll the map or sell the map and get a new map in exchange, because this is instant death. This weapon will kill you very fast because, once again, this version of Boneshatter does a lot of damage. When you see the effectiveness of added damage, all of that elemental damage you're seeing there, that's all getting pumped a lot. That's a lot of extra damage getting thrown back at you if you attack an enemy that has elemental reflect on them. Yeah, so if you get into maps with this, do not and you have a weapon like mine that has elemental damage on it. You know, like, do not enter a map that has damage reflect. You will not survive. We're supporting our Boneshatter with Shockwave. Shockwave requires that the weapon is either your bare fists, a mace, a staff, or a scepter. Oh, it can be an axe also. Oh no, it looks like... Oh. Sorry. Looking at the wrong thing. There we go. Oh yeah, look at that. Like, you can't do it with your bare hands anymore. I could have swore that you used to be able to use the support gem if you were unarmed, but I guess not anymore. Or maybe that was never the case and I'm remembering wrong. But, you know, like, you need a weapon that doesn't have, you know, that can't be considered like a slashing weapon. You know? Then, of course, the stun support that I mentioned before. And since this is the only version of Boneshatter that does not build trauma, we're adding the trauma. And the reason we're adding the trauma is that by upping the quality on the trauma support, we get even more reduced enemy stun threshold. For equipment, everything is armor and evasion. All of my pieces are armor evasion. Then all my accessories are just, you know, trying to cover my resistances as much as I can. And we can see defensively, I've got a decent amount of armor and a decent amount of evasion, and a pretty good amount of regen. I'm undercapped on cold, which is very bad, and I'm undercapped on chaos resistance. And that's all the defenses we have. Because this is a build meant to overpower, not survive. We're running auto exertion with Ancestral Cry and Intimidating Cry. So anytime that our cries go off, like, we will be hitting a much larger area and we will be dealing tremendously more damage. I'm running Vitality and Blood and Sand on an Arrogance support gem, so we're reserving part of our health pool. And then we're using our mana to support Clarity and a Vulnerability Curse on a Blasphemy Curse Aura. So that's what our mana is being taken up by. And then for Leap Stam, I'm supporting that with a life tap, so that way, you know, I don't have to worry about it using up our mana when I'm moving around. Then Enduring Cry, just for trying to build up some extra recovery and defenses. Some other highlights on our skill tree are that we are using this Warcry cluster here, which gets us faster Warcry speed, and also makes it that we deal increased damage each time we've Warcried recently. So our Enduring Cry is actually able to give us a little bit more damage if we use it at the right times. And then we got the Warcry Mastery, where we recover life whenever we use a Warcry. We're getting a nice little heal every time that we get those off. I also took this damage over time cluster here for the damage over time mastery, so that way we take less damage over time, and got these nodes that increase the amount of duration of our bleeding, and makes it that bleeding enemies cannot inflict bleeding on us. We have the mace mastery. It makes it that we crush enemies on hit anytime we hit them with a mace or scepter. And since we're using a mace, that means that all of our hits crush, which means that all of our hits cause enemies to take more physical damage. We took Resolute Technique, so we can't deal any critical strikes, but we don't have to invest in accuracy at all, which is, very big for allowing us to get an okay amount of defenses along with all of our damage. And this melee area of effect cluster right here. So we have much bigger areas, and we got the attack mastery to make it that enemies can't block our attacks. With all that out of the way, let's see the build in action. As you can see, our bleeds are very effective.
You've already done this before. You are caught in a loop.
We have massive hit areas. Yeah, just making sure no stragglers. Nothing survived. There's really not much to explain with this one. You see a thing, you hit the thing dies.
Oh.
Either right away or eventually.
Well done. Now be a good assistant and find a place to deploy a tower. Gaia's flame. The blight is reacting. It's put out new mycelium. New roots.
Can't do this just yet.
Yeah, like I said, it is not a tanky build. It is just a strong build. Oh, there was a Shaggler. Oh well.
Finally, come on.
Yeah, the big group explosions are very satisfying. That's a perfect one for us.
Gambling with our lives.
This one is insane. I don't know why anyone would ever pick that.
Give the order.
Let's go. Yeah, the death pulse is just very cool. I like the death pulse. It's the only, like, above even the Gladiator bleed thing, I like the death pulse. It's all of them.
I believe in traveling light. Oh, and a big reason for why I picked this skill combination that I forgot to mention at the start is that when you do this, because since we're using Boneshatter, which is a strike skill, and we're supporting it with Shockwave, which is an extra skill on top of that, and then our Boneshatter, like our Boneshatter of Carnage, every time there is a stun occurs, it does that extra pulse. Like you're technically like hitting like 3 times each time you hit. Which means that like each time you hit is a chance to cause bleeding and a chance to aggravate that bleeding. So you have multiple chances to both cause and aggravate bleeding every time you hit. Which is what I meant at the beginning when I said that, like, it was like an obvious thing, and that I was surprised that I wasn't seeing anybody doing it. That was a reason for the whole stun thing. Yeah. The entire premise, I don't know how it is that the premise of why I was going over all of the reduced stun durations, the stun threshold stuff. I went over all of that into such detail and didn't explain why it was so important. Yeah, because you need to massively reduce enemy stun threshold so that you can increase the likelihood that you are dealing multiple hits simultaneously, which in turn gives you the most value of your bleeding and chances to aggravate the bleeding. Yeah, sorry I forgot, just brain fart at the start there. Yeah, but you can see this is very strong. Highly recommend trying it out if you're someone who likes doing big bunk builds. So yeah, so like it's a very stable, very easy to put together character. Because once again, like the only thing that really matters is that you're making sure that you're getting as many sources of reducing enemy threshold as possible to get those bleeds. To get the increased chances that you're going to be dealing those multiple hits per hit that then each have their own chance to cause bleeding and aggravate bleeding at the same time. Because there's nothing here that is if you don't have this bespoke piece of equipment, then you won't be able to pull this off. There's nothing like that here. That's going to be it for me. Thanks everybody for stopping by and checking me out. If you found these tips useful, appreciate doing YouTube stuff. Like, comment, subscribe. Until next time, Victus, Virus Demaris, and bye.